Now, the other side of the debate differs, right, with the free market capitalist solution by arguing that the problem is not the commons. Right? In fact, this side of the argument is going to argue that it is important that we have commonly held resources, right? That important resources be available to all people, that we share collectively in the bounty of the earth and so forth. The problem from their perspective, the fly in the ointment, is this motivation. The problem is that most people as individuals are self-interested, profit seekers, and that is the thing that leads to the dysfunctional tragedy of the commons scenarios. So, to put the cells in place, the side is going to say that the problem is self-interest. The way this is sometimes put is to say, right, that people are greedy, right, or they are profit-seeking, right, in a pejorative sense. So we put the cell around here. And what that leads them to do is to think about their own personal advantages and not the effect of their actions on other people, or to maximize their short-term benefits to themselves and to ignore the longer-term effects of that on the community as a whole. So self-interest is a bad thing, or at least a dysfunctional, right, element in the scenario, and this side is in favor of commonly held, shared, mutually accessible resources. It's more likely to think that private property is not a fundamentally valuable institution, socially speaking. So what we then need to do is not privatize the resource, but the solution rather will be to limit, right, or override the effects of private self-seeking behavior. Override the profit motive, override the self-interest, stop the tendency of greedy behavior from manifesting itself in socially destructive results. And so what we then need is, rather than instituting private property that is then protected by the government, instead the proper solution is going to be government management, right, of the resource. So we say that the resource is a public property, right? It's a community property. It's a socially valuable resource. The government is the institution that makes decisions on behalf of the community as a whole or society as a whole. And so if we have an important, valuable resource that we want to be held in common, it makes sense that the government, as our agent or representative, assumes the management of that resource. Now, what the government then will do is put in place a variety, right, of policies that will change people's incentives, right, with respect to how they use the resource. So rather than just leaving it up to individuals freely to decide for themselves how many cows they're going to put out, how long they're going to leave them out, therefore, and so forth, we will have the government say, here is how much resource we have, or here's how much land we have, here's how many people we have, and we will decide in a central fashion how many cows you may put out, for how much time you can put them out, right, and so forth. In order to engage in maintenance and improvement, we're saying that here people voluntarily were not ponying up the resources that were necessary. And so since these things do need to be done, but people are not voluntarily willing to do so, we need to tax people. And so we will send people a tax bill. Here's how much we need for improvements. Here's how much we need to engage in maintenance, right, and so forth. And it's for the good of the community, so we have the rationale for imposing taxation. We might then say, in addition, out of community spirit, right, since this is something that we're all doing, if there's a certain amount of maintenance that is necessary for the good of the resource, we need people to do weeding, we need people to dig wells, we need people to put up fences, plant trees, right, and so forth. Under this scenario, people were not voluntarily doing that labor. So in this case, what we might say is we can mandate, right, that people engage in that behavior. And so we will engage in what's known as conscription. kind of not a draft, not necessarily for military purposes, but for broader social purposes. And so people are assigned. You have to do 2 hours of weeding or 3 hours of fence building and so forth. And then, of course, the government can pass all of these pieces of legislation and regulation, but we need to make sure that people are doing what they're supposed to be doing, that people aren't sneaking extra cows out when they're not allowed to, that they are, in fact, paying their tax bill, that they are showing up for their public duty when they're assigned to do so. And so we're going to need a significant amount of policing in order to do so, and this policing has to have some teeth in it, and so there have to be various penalties in place that if you don't pay your taxes or if you violate the rationing orders, then you are subject to various sanctions and so on. All right, so what then we have is an array of regulations that the government can put in place. And the argument is that with the right judicious mix of rationing, taxation, conscription, policing, and penalties in place, the government will maximize the long-term value of the resource and we will end up with a socially win-win result. The resource is managed appropriately in a way that preserves its common value. Self-interest is managed against its socially destructive results, thereby leading to this result as well. Now, what we then have is obviously not a free market capitalist solution if we start putting labels on here, but in its strongest form, if we assume and we generalize this point that all of the significant resources of a society belong to the community as a whole, and it's the job of the government to manage them by means of these particular kinds of policies, then the best label for that is a kind of socialism. Okay.